We have just completed a knife which I, in my distant memory, recalled that we could make a knife like this every 20 minutes or 3 an hour when we got rolling in the mass production using bandsaw blades or the steel from the carpenter saws instead of the normal thick blacksmith type of version of knife. Like we see, these knives have a fairly thick blade, a bit thinner. Incidentally, here's a Swedish knife that was called a Swedish carpenter's knife, which when you look at it, it's got the thinness of blade because it bends very readily. And this is a knife that's enclosed in the handle to protect it. And so you've got the issue of being able to hide the cutting edge of the blade in the handle when it's in the toolbox without having a sheath. Or I think you also have the option of being able to set the depth. And I think this end is possibly handy for puttying windows or something. So there's nothing new under the sun, you might say. So here, at any rate, using a grinder and cold chisel and belt sanders, we shape out the blade and we use something handy. I like to use hockey handles for the handle because they're the predetermined size. Here's a knife that I made in probably 1967, where after making perhaps a few hundred, I kept a few. And that was to replace, this knife was issued to the RCAF and then issued and reissued. This is the Russell belt knife. And the circumstance was that the blade was so dull that even with good tools, you have to put a lot of effort in getting a functional edge. So instead, Tom Roycroft, my guru, had come up with the idea of making these knives very simply so that they were pennies to make, and lending these out or giving them to students who hadn't brought a knife to be able to replace the dull one in making all the feather sticks and traps and deadfalls and whatever. Now we sharpened this on a belt sander until I could see visually that the far edge was being turned over. That, I think, one name for that is the burr. And when I saw that the burr was fully developed, then I took a steel and I removed the burr, because a burr makes the knife feel rather dull. And then I tested this for minimal sharpness. And minimal sharpness means that when you can cut paper like that, that when you're sharpening a knife, you do not need to use the coarse. There are 4 stages: coarse, medium, fine, and hone. And you don't, that's the test to prove you don't need to use the coarse. And it's also the test that shows that the knife has got a functional edge to it, that I can use it, and perhaps it isn't a shaving edge, but you can most certainly make feathers and peel sticks and cut notches with the knife. Now the features we look for in the knife, in review, is that the knife is not too big. Actually, you can always favor yourself in going too small. I could have a 1 or 2 finger blade on this knife and it might just about be better than anything else. But first of all, if the blade is bigger than 4 fingers, then generally you're starting to get too big a blade for our purposes. The continuous curvature allows us to put a very fine edge on there at a minimum of effort. And there's a point on the knife that allows us to make holes. And when we make holes in wood, we make rectangular holes. So we'd like to have a nice, long, thin point that will go pretty deep in the making of holes through a stick, especially in the construction of certain traps. And when you don't have a drill, then the hole you make is rectangular, so you cut across the grain. So I like to have a fairly pointy tip, and the handle should be one that gives you absolute control with regard to where the leading edge of the knife goes. And perhaps a rectangular handle, or maybe broad at the back and narrow at the front a little bit, will fit into the hand much more tightly than oval, and the stress and the ability to be able to cut with the leading edge is enhanced, I think, with the handle. The other thing I find quite often is handles are often too short. And here we make sure that with a big spreading hand and doing a great deal of work, that the handle is a little bit longer, maybe if 4 fingers plus a finger. A knife, the blade is held in place with 1 or 2 rivets. If you use 1 rivet, you cut this at an angle and you got to work at fitting it very snugly, but you do away with the trouble of making that extra hole and having to provide that extra rivet. Well, we have reached the stage where the minimal stage of sharpness has been reached, and we now want to work on this to improve this. Here, essentially, I'm sawing through the paper, but that is a minimal stage of sharpness. A knife that won't do that is too dull to be used. You probably, it's tiring and perhaps have more accidents with such a knife. Now, the one way to set up the sharpening system is to go to the industrial dollar stores. They sell these. There was a time when I used to buy these for $1 each. But because they're so irregular as stones, you have to have at least 2. If you got a class set, you don't have to have 2 because people can borrow each other. And you'll see that these are man-made because there are 2 grits. You can see a finer one and a coarser one, and they seem to be sort of welded together. So if you go coarse to coarse and you rub each other a great deal, they'll true each other. Because it's important that the grinding surface be as even as possible, so that when you run your knife on that grinding surface that you're getting a smooth effect. Now, almost any stone, now I happen to be collecting my stones, and I have 2 stones here that I suspect are quarried. No, that one isn't, that's oiled, but this one is quarried. Now, the value of this quarried stone is astronomical. Of all I know, I might be holding a $50 stone in my hand. And that stone is of the class that's called a hone, which we normally substitute with bathroom tiles. But at any rate, if you're going to use stones like this, now these are about half the length they should be, and I have often suggested that you put 4 of these together, and then in a form where they're held there, and then using a 5th one, even them all out, and then you'll have a decent surface to work with. Now, that's the way stones come generally, but there are stones, and they're horrendously expensive. They'll be twice as long and half again as wide. So with this fine side, I don't have to really use the coarse side. I may work on this for a short while. When you use a stone, it seems like slicing produces a more satisfying effect. If you drag, then you'll get a bigger burr, and in removing that burr you get a much coarser situation. But to be honest, I'm not exactly sure to explain why you get a better effect by slicing rather than dragging. But it seems like most people who sharpen will use that technique to put an edge on. Now when you start getting into finer surfaces and lighter surfaces and cheaper stones, if you can buy a stone like this for $1, if you can, that's great. But you can end up making a sharpening board using wet and dry sandpaper. Probably we have $1 invested here because the paper is stuck on with carpet tape. You put on the carpet tape first, and then you put on the paper. And you have the option of putting different grits. And I would say this here is probably what we would call medium. What you do is once you've established a slicing edge, then you start using different grits and stepping down so that they get finer and finer until finally you're as smooth as smooth as some of these stones. But people often say, well, what is the issue here? How can you sharpen anything with something so smooth? Well, the coarse scratches made by The coarse stone are erased by the medium scratches, which in turn are erased by the fine scratches, which in turn are erased altogether, so you don't have teeth at all. You only have a wavy edge, and that surface that you're using there is the hone. Feeling this is the grabbier side, so this is medium. Now if I take, for every medium stroke, I have to take 10 fine strokes. And for every fine stroke, I'll have to take 10 for every fine stroke, I'll have to take 10 strokes on the hone. Now, a knowledgeable person can do all kinds of things that the learner can't appreciate or use. But you're holding your knife at a very precise angle, and the functional angle for these thin blades that are flexible and so on, probably at the width of your thumb or the width of a normal hunting knife, it's about 2 25-cent pieces. And the thicker the back of the knife blade, the more 25-cent pieces, but usually you go to the back. This knife is sharpened in what we call the Scandi way. There's the Scandi sharpening, which means that there's a very, very serious and distinct bevel face. The blade is quite thick, but you end up having this, the part that's next to the cutting edge, which is fairly broad. And it's very easy to learn how to sharpen these, because all you have to do is ride that sub bevel so that you see that it's shining, and by rubbing it you're holding the knife at precisely the correct angle. And the Swedes have chosen the angle to range somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees if you cut notches in a piece of paper and keep fitting them, and then taking that notch to a protractor, you'll discover that it's somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees. So this particular knife here will be 12.5 degrees, because that's the one that the Swedes have adopted in most of their, at least the normal knife makers. Well, here I work on this until I feel now, here too, that if you have a sensitive feel, you work on both sides, and then when you figure it's almost time to quit, then you work on the one side a little while, or a while, till you feel a grab. And when you sense a feel, if you can detect that grab, then you can quit. And once you detect the grab, you do a few of these strokes and then go to the next step down. Well, the next step down is a hone. The surface of this hone is very smooth. I mentioned using a tile. If you give me a moment, I think I have a tile back here somewhere. Or I did. Tiles. My imagination is playing tricks with me. These ceramic tiles are very inexpensive. And as a result, when you give a sharpening talk, you give it away. So, to my horror, as I was gathering my things together, I found I couldn't find one of my tiles. Well, we'll just have to do with the real thing then. So here we have a very smooth surface. Taking two tiles and rub them together, you might eventually erase all of the dimples and everything else on the back of that ceramic tile that might be used in the kitchen or the bathroom. Now, if I took 10 strokes with medium, I'm going to have to take 30 with fine, and I'm going to have to take 30 with hone. So it means that it's 100 strokes to be able to achieve the type of end that we want to. And very often, and I'm looking on the stone and I can see a smear. When I have the tile, when you're working on the tile, you'll see a color coming off the tile, because you obviously are abrading something away because it's smearing. Now, if I'm patient enough and do this, theoretically, I should be able to shave the hair on my arm with this knife that I just made a few minutes ago. And I could get a better feel if I had that tile, because the tile is something about that. And then I will take some strokes, and I take a very definite stroke and I see a very clear smear. And I do that a few times on each side. Then I often figure I have used the hone long enough. And that's still not enough. Well, here with each level of work we get a much easier cut. But to shave, you have to strop. And any good belt with any texture is apt to be sufficient for stropping. So 10 strokes on the medium might require 300 strokes on the strop. And the other thing that we have with the strop is that the strop is not that abrasive as much as it generates, at least this is the story that has been told to me, that it's meant to generate heat to burn off the burr. And in so doing, you reharden the leading edge, you remove the burr much more cleanly by burning it off. And the way to enhance that process is to use a alloy called babbitt, which is still used today. And if the babbitt is rubbed on here to the extent that you can actually see, this is probably got lead and tin or something in it, that the babbitt will actually leave a kind of a black smear on your strap. Now that's ultimately going a whole hog, you might say. And so now now stropping, you have no choice but to drag, because if you try to lead, you'll just slice your belt off. And if you hear a noise like this, I'm using the back of the blade, I'm brutalizing. That's brutalizing it. I don't want to hear too much of a grinding action. And of course I got to do an awful lot of these strokes to be able to achieve the given end. Okay, well, let's see if it'll do a little. Well, there we go. We have shaved with a cutting edge. And you can see the clear spot. So if your razor is lost, the other day I was reading an article on razors, and in the old days the straight razor, you had one for each day of the week. And I can't remember at the moment, but what I was flabbergasted with is that you had 7 razors, and the Monday razor was only used on Monday. So here we go, we have put the edge on this knife, and we find that the paper test is carried out, that this steel is not the hardest steel. It's workable. You don't have to have a forge, and yet you can put on an edge that will give you many, that will be very effective in the acid test. If a knife is not configured to be able to give you shavings, then there's one big advantage that you have lost. Now the difference between this knife and this knife is that this knife is supposed to be unbreakable. And so it's made much more sturdy, because I've always said that an ideal survival knife is a pry bar that works wood very, very well. Well, here you've got the opposite end of the spectrum, something that can be very light. And in some cases in the kit you're carrying just the blade and you fashion a handle when you need it. And even at that, and very inexpensive. And shaves wood, peels sticks, makes feather sticks, cuts down wrist thick trees. So it does an awful lot of things, but maybe if you're caught in an airplane and you have to cut your way out, maybe this knife will survive the type of process, whereas this thin-bladed knife might not be up to it. That it might just be not substantial enough to be able to do something like cut yourself out of an aircraft. The information on sharpening might cause people's head to spin. It might help if you can read about the process. Well, off the internet you get the basic safe travel and boreal survival. It essentially has a version of sharpening that is found in bushcraft. And an update and made into a more portable form is a booklet. It's this size. We just don't happen to have the booklet handy, but it devotes 32 pages to sharpening and explaining in considerable detail the most recent information on the techniques of sharpening. And in the DVD here, you have a detailed demonstration of the whole sharpening process that no holds barred and in very great detail. So if you are wanting to train yourself, it would be highly recommended to be able to know everything that's said about the subject here about knives, and the issue that if you own a knife, you might want to know why you're carrying the knife, and on the other extreme, since you have a knife, you should be able to shave with it.